Well, welcome to this webinar on raising boys and girls with a healthy view of masculinity. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I run Foundation Worldview, which is a ministry designed to equip Christian adults with the skills that they need to get their kids to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. And I'm so excited for this webinar because today in our culture, there is so much confusion over what masculinity is and what masculinity isn't. And I just thought in my own life of some recent examples where I saw just such healthy views of masculinity and then wondered, will these views stay as these children grow? A couple months ago, I was FaceTiming with my sister and my 2-year-old niece. And my 2-year-old niece, she was doing a really good job of holding a conversation. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the conversation, she completely dropped what she was saying. Her eyes got really big. Her face turned towards a different direction. And I knew the words that were going to come out of her mouth. And those words were, Daddy. And she ran away from FaceTime. And I was just so delighted that she was so excited to see her dad. And then it was really interesting. Several weeks later, I was with my brother and his family, and I was playing with my 3-year-old niece, and she fell down and she scraped her knee. And I was comforting her, but obviously I knew she wanted her parents to comfort her. And I was expecting her to cry out, Mommy, because her mom was actually the parent that was closest. But instead, she cried out, Daddy, Daddy, help me. And I thought, wow, these little nieces of mine, they have such a healthy, innocent view of who their dads are and how their dads were designed to love them and to protect them and to comfort them. And then I thought, what's going to happen to my nieces as they grow up in this culture and as well as my nephews? In our culture, in this moment, everything that is traditionally associated with masculinity is viewed as toxic. And men are not really being equipped and encouraged to live out masculinity. And so that's why I'm so excited for this webinar today, because it is going to be based around the contents of this book called The Toxic War on Masculinity by Professor Nancy Pearcey. And so if you haven't picked up a copy of this book yet, we recently recommended it in our Foundation Worldview Book Club. Make sure you do that. This book is going to be an excellent complement to everything we talk through today. But without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our guest, Professor Nancy Pearcey. So Professor Pearcey, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. You have such a teacher's heart, I can tell. So I love talking to other teachers.
Yes, I do as well. Well, before we dive into actually talking about this concept of masculinity, can you just give us a brief, quick snapshot of why you chose to write this book? Because this book is slightly different than some of the other topics that you've covered recently.
Yes, but it is a form of apologetics. So I teach
Mm.
apologetics at Houston
Mhm.
Christian University, and everything I write is on apologetics. And so I consider this, I wanted to understand the secular view of masculinity.
Mm.
How did the secular world get its view of masculinity so wrong? Where did
Mhm.
it come from, and how can we analyze that, and how can we prepare our children to respond biblically? And my eye was caught by an article in the Washington Post, and the
Mhm.
title was "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really,
Wow.
in a mainstream publication, the Huffington Post editor tweeted hashtag "Kill all men,"
Wow.
and then said it was a joke. I don't think it's
Wow.
funny. Speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say "So many men, so little ammunition,"
Oh my goodness.
and there are books with titles that are very blunt, like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men,"
Mhm.
and "Are Men Necessary?"
Hmm.
So, and then what really surprised me was that some men are jumping on the bandwagon too. A male
Hmm.
author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer.
Wow.
And this one you may have seen because it was in the news just a few months ago. But the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
Wow.
And so this is what I wanted to address.
Mhm.
Young men especially, you're an educator, so you're looking especially at the younger generation. And there was a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, the young men coming into my practice are increasingly depressed and
Hmm.
demoralized because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity.
Mm.
And the surveys show that as well. Surveys show there was one in 2024, so very recent, and it was global. It was several different countries, and they found that 50% of men now say that society seems to punish men just for acting like men.
Mm.
But then when they limited it to younger men, 18 to 25, the numbers were much higher.
Wow.
They were asked, do you agree with the statement that nowadays discrimination against men has become even greater than discrimination against women? And the young men say yes.
Hmm.
So there's a generational divide here where the younger men are feeling much more that they're growing up. Well, let me give you an example from my own classroom. So when I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Wow.
Yeah, so that was the problem I wanted to address with this book. I
Mm.
wanted to say, I think this is a much bigger problem than we've realized up till now. That our men and boys are falling behind in so many measures, and it's time for us to ask, how can we
Mm.
help them? How can we show compassion to them?
Yes, which I love, and I think your book does so successfully that as I was reading through it, I read through it very quickly because it was such an easy read and it was so much helpful information. And so one thing I'd love for you to talk through with us that I found very interesting as I read through the book is that, nowadays we tend when we talk about masculinity, we tend to think that, masculinity is traits such as like incredibly aggressive behavior and lack of emotion and distant relationships and like the self-made man. However, as I was reading through your book, you're writing on the Puritans and the early colonial life in America made clear that this perception that we have today has not always been so. So can you kind of walk us through, in early American life, what the perception was of masculinity and healthy masculinity?
I know this is where a historical account is so helpful because we realize
Mm.
we don't have to take today as the norm.
Mhm.
Because we live in a secular culture and we're surrounded by secular ideas of masculinity. And you go back to the colonial era, which was largely Christian. And the biggest difference was that prior to the Industrial Revolution, men worked with their wives and children all day
Mm.
on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so a man was working with people that he loved and had a moral bond with. And the
Mm.
cultural expectation focused much more on men's caretaking role. In fact,
Mm.
I was surprised to find that most of the literature on child rearing and parenting was addressed to fathers,
So
not to mothers.
interesting.
I mean, if you go in a typical bookstore today, right, they're all to mothers. But no,
Mhm.
the father was considered the primary parent. And so the
Hmm.
books addressed him and or both of them, but never just the mother, not until
Yeah.
much later. And so even secular historians will say things like the colonial concept of masculine virtue was duty to God and man.
Hmm.
So you were supposed to be not only a father to your family, but a very common phrase back then was father of the community. You were supposed to
Hmm.
bring that fathering ethos out into the wider community, into the church, the school, the civil society. And so the question is, how did we lose that really nurturing, caring view of masculinity? And by the way, I don't want to overemphasize that because they were making their way in a wilderness. So
Right.
they still did have to show their more sort of stereotypically masculine traits like mastery and resilience and courage and so on.
Mhm.
But it was balanced much more by the notion that, as the godly head of the household, you had
Mm.
responsibility to the spiritual life of your family. So after the Industrial Revolution, work was taken out of the home. And of course,
Mm.
men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with family members, with people they loved. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And
Mm.
as you can imagine, that was a very different environment.
Yes.
And already in the 19th century, you see people start to complain. In the literature of the day, people began to complain that men were losing their caretaking ethos
Mm.
of the earlier time, that they were becoming self centered, egocentric, self seeking, greedy, acquisitive, to use the language of the day, and turning their financial success into an idol. That instead
Mhm.
of having a strong Christian understanding of work and vocation, they were turning, career success into an idol.
Mm.
And so that is the first time that we see negative language applied to the male character. Most
Mm,
people think that maybe started with the 1960s, second wave feminism. And so it's really surprising to me. No, in the 19th century,
mm,
they were already saying that men are becoming these tough, self centered, like you just said, emotionally cold, self-seeking,
mm,
aggressive, ambitious, etc. You know, the negative traits that we now associate with
mm,
masculinity began to be attributed to men in the 19th century. And of
mm.
course, that does show also where the solution has to lie is can we reconnect fathers to their families even in an
Yes.
ancestral age?
Yes, which I'm sure we'll talk more about in a little bit. But that's so interesting. And then that was one thing that I found so interesting while reading your book is just seeing what this more puritanical colonial view was that, like fathers were like the leaders of their family and the community. And that involved both this industriousness, and resilience, but also this compassion and kindness. And when I read in your book about how most of the literature, parenting literature was written to men, I was like, you have got to be kidding me. Like, oh my goodness, this is such a different view. So now you've talked a little bit about how men, changed as they were in competition with other men, they were removed from their families. What effect did the Industrial Revolution pulling fathers outside of the home? What effect did that really have on the wives and children then?
Yeah, we're so used to it now that we have to almost read this literature to understand it was experienced as traumatic. Um, Let me give you some quotes from the time. People felt like the family had been hollowed out.
Mm,
1842, Parents Magazine had an article in which it said the greatest cause of domestic sorrow these days is paternal neglect. That the
mm,
father works early and late and has no time to perform his duties to his children.
mm,
Another a book that came out 1881 said um, the greatest tragedy of our American way of life is that the father, the central figure of the home, the mainstay of the home, hardly lives with his family at all. So
mm,
the fathers were technically in the home, but they were out of the home all day. Or my favorite quote is from the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. She is considered the most influential woman of the 19th century.
mm,
And she said, God is our father. And yet the prototype of the divine is out of the house
mm,
from Sunday to Sunday.
mm.
And so people experienced it as incredibly traumatic at the time. One sociologist writes, it was especially hard for sons, right? Because girls at least still had their mother at home. They had a role model
Right.
of what it meant to be a woman. But sons lost that day in and day out role model of what it meant
Mm,
to be a man. And so sociologists write things like, this was the first uh, masculine identity crisis, or
mm,
they say, young boys lost connection to the adult world, the world of adult males.
mm,
Um, and many people noticed that boys were also growing, their behavior was growing worse because they were not being supervised by their fathers all day.
mm,
The leading psychologist of the 19th century wrote, never before has the American boy been so wild
mm,
and so half orphaned,
mm,
because and then he said because he's been left to female guidance in home, school, and church.
mm,
And so, not surprisingly, as these young men grew up, the 19th century became a period where there's a huge explosion of crime, prostitution,
mhm,
drinking, gambling, gang activity,
mm,
because these young boys who've been not had father supervision grew up. Of course, they were also
mm.
going into the cities where they were separated from
Right.
traditional forms of accountability like family, church, and village. But all the history books talk about how there was a huge increase in crime and
Mhm.
prostitution and drinking and so on. So that's what happened when fathers left the home. It really was traumatic.
Yeah. And I was thinking about how in your book you mentioned some of like the literature of the time, even fiction literature and like satirical literature, like Tom Sawyer, is portraying like this wild boy who's rebelling against, the feminizing influences in his life. And just thinking through how important it is for both boys and girls, but specifically for boys to have the father in the home. I was actually just talking with a friend this week because in 2 weeks I'm on the nursery rotation at my church, and I was looking at who is on the nursery rotation, and there are a number of men of dads who
Mm,
serve in our
mm,
nursery. And so I'm going to be on with one of the dads in 2 weeks, and I was like, oh, I'm so grateful that one of the other workers is a male because it's just different. It's just different. And I was like, the kids behave better, even though I'm a teacher, and I know how to create order. I'm like, it's just different when there's a male present. So I can see how that would be so important.
Let me
Um,
t let me answer that thing about that literature because I get a lot of skepticism from that.
hmm,
People didn't used to say boys will be boys. Like,
hmm,
they didn't just expect that boys would naturally be more misbehaving than
hmm,
girls. And so in the book, I have to show that actually the literature for boys, before Tom Sawyer, the literature for boys presented you know, um, well-behaving,
hmm,
virtuous young boys
hmm,
because the literature wanted to show a model. So the typical one was Little Lord Fauntleroy, which is a fairly famous classic book. And these angelic boys, they even help redeem the reprobate adults around them.
hmm,
Tiny Tim would be another example,
hmm,
who helps
hmm.
Scrooge, to
Yeah.
change, to transform. So the literature before Tom Sawyer actually did show boys being virtuous and
Hmm,
good, and they were held up as models.
hmm,
And Mark Twain was explicitly satirizing that earlier moralistic literature. This was
hmm,
not just observing the boys around him.
hmm.
He wanted
Interesting.
to tear down that older literature that presented
Huh.
positive models for boys to follow. And yes, he was a great writer. Uh, but his goal was actually to say, well, boys will be boys. He was
Hmm,
reflecting the fact that boys were now growing up in a different environment. And even the idea that boys and men, that the male sex as a whole is more
hmm,
prone to sin and vice, is is a creation of the 19th century. All the
hmm,
way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people thought men were more virtuous.
hmm,
They thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight,
hmm.
and they thought men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. In fact, the Latin root of the word virtue is vir, which means
Hmm.
man in
Wow.
Latin, like the word virile, meaning
Uh-huh.
manly. So up until the 19th century, people thought men were more virtuous.
Hmm,
So they would not portray boys as misbehaving or, particularly rambunctious and wild and unmanageable because they thought that men and boys actually had a stronger moral
hmm,
sense. And so the reversal of that, which we have today, our double standard, that portrays women as somehow more
hmm,
virtuous or more spiritually inclined, is a product of the 19th century. And we have to realize it is completely novel in all
hmm,
of human history. No other culture has ever held up women as morally superior to men.
hmm. So interesting. And I think it's so important for us to understand because I'm sure for everyone watching and listening right now that this is something that many of us have never thought through before, but is now going to become more evident when we see it in cultural literature or shows or programs. So, for all of the parents watching, this would just be a charge to you to be very intentional at the literature you are having your children engage with. How is it presenting males and females? Is it just having more of this, bad boy mentality, or is it actually presenting some more men who are virtuous? And if you're not familiar with the Wing Feather Saga by Andrew Peterson, we've recommended those books for the past 4 months in our book club. Those books, the two main characters, well, there's three main characters. Two are male, one is female, and the boys do a great job of just presenting how to wrestle with your sin while still choosing to live virtuously. So, highly recommend that series. Another thing, Professor Piercy, that I wanted to talk about is in your book, I was really fascinated by how you showed how, post the Industrial Revolution and all of the things that you just described, Americans began to embrace what you call the secular guy code. So can you describe, what this code is and how it's really taken root in our culture?
Yeah, let me start with a sociological study.
Mm,
Um, there was a sociologist named Michael Kimmel who's very famous, and so he speaks all around the world. And he came up with a clever experiment to find out what young men themselves think.
hmm,
And so he asked them two questions. First, he says, "What does it mean to be a good man?" At a funeral, in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? All around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that question. They would
Mm,
immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a
mm,
protector, be a provider, be responsible. And he would say, "Where'd you learn that?" And they'd say, "I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe." Or we would say, "Well, they're made in God's image." And there is this innate, inherent, and apparently
mm,
universal knowledge of what it means to be the good man.
mm,
Men realize that their unique masculine strengths are not given them just to get whatever they want, but to protect, to provide for those that they
mm,
love. But then he would follow up with a second question. The sociologist would ask young men, "What does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man?" And the young men themselves would say, "No, no, no, that's completely different.
huh,
That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid." I'm
mm,
using their language.
mhm,
And so the sociologist concluded, he was not a Christian, but he said, "Look, young men are trapped between these two competing scripts. On the
mm,
one hand, they are reflecting God's image, or we might say Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. They do understand that they're what it means to be the good man, but they feel cultural pressure to fulfill these other traits, the quote unquote real man, which are very different. And in a secular culture where they get disconnected from any moral ideal, they
mm,
can easily slide into misogyny, dominance, control, and the
mhm,
other traits that we now consider toxic.
mhm.
And so I put this at the front of the book because, Elizabeth, this has proved to be the most controversial book I've written. And that surprised me, actually,
Wow.
because my earlier book, Love Thy Body, was on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism.
Right.
And I was surprised that masculinity is even more of a trigger word.
Mm.
And so I put this study at the front of the book because what it did is help people to realize, calm down. I'm not going to I'm not going to just wholesale attack masculinity.
Mhm,
I'll give you the background. Whenever I write a book, I run a lot of reading groups to rub off the rough edges, right?
mm.
And when they would tell their family and friends that they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first question was, "Whose side is she on?"
Huh.
Like you have to take a side.
Wow.
And most men assumed that a woman writing a book on masculinity would be a male bashing feminist. And more progressive types tended to assume that I was some sort of a red pill culture warrior, defending, a very archaic version of masculinity. So I
Mm,
put this at the front of the book to say, no, no, we can all agree on the good man
mhm,
and defend it and encourage it, support it. And we can all agree to critique the secular version that came out as the quote unquote real man in that survey. And so that it really helped get people past that initial
mhm,
hostility. And once people got into the book, like you, most of them thought, "Oh, this is very interesting. I didn't know this
mhm,
history." But boy, I really had to work hard to get them past that initial suspicion or hostility. And that's what
mhm,
this survey did. And I would add another thing too is it gives us a better way to approach these issues
mhm.
because most men don't respond very well to being called toxic. Right?
Right.
Nobody would. So what we can do is say, can we tap into that innate universal knowledge of what it
Mhm.
means to be the good man? Can we affirm it, support it, encourage it? And that gives us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Yes, which I love that, and I love how you set that up in your book, the good man versus the real man, and I actually, oddly enough, I found a little bit of that, not hostility, but, just what you were describing with people thinking like, "Oh, whose side is she on?" Because after I finished the book, I posted about it on Facebook, just with a review and why I thought it was so fabulous, and then I was at church the next Sunday, and during the passing of the peace, when everybody's, talking in the middle of the service, there was a group of three men talking, and one of them was like, "Oh, Elizabeth, I saw that book you posted on Facebook. I want to get it." And so then I just came over and joined the conversation. And one of the other men was like, "What was the book?" And I mentioned it, and then he immediately went into like a defense of masculinity. And I was like, "No, no, no! This is not called the war on toxic masculinity. It's called the toxic war on masculinity." And he was like, oh, that's different. And I was like, yes, yes, it is different. And so I really loved how you didn't take, an approach, obviously, like this liberal feminist approach of bashing anything masculine, but also didn't, just try to pull back, to this archaic version of masculinity that is mainly just drawn from the industrial revolution. Now in the book, something we haven't talked about yet is you have a section where you talk about how certain streams of Christianity tried to combat what the industrial revolution had started, and you call it in that section muscular Christianity. So can you talk us through historically how some streams of Christianity have tried to combat this, and then we'll circle back to how does Christianity actually uphold and support masculinity?
Yeah, so this is the name of the movement. It's not my label. It's
Right.
historians' label, Muscular Christianity. Well, fortunately, we've set it up already because we said the 19th century, for the first time, set up women as morally superior to men. And women were said to be the moral guardians of society. And this was part of the secularizing process because after the Industrial Revolution, there developed a huge public sphere, right, of factories, financial institutions, banks, um, the universities, and the state. And many people began to argue that the public sphere should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value free. In other words, don't
Mhm.
bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. And first of all, since it was men who were working in that public sphere and getting that secular education, they did become secular earlier than women did. And so that too contributed to the breakdown of a biblical view of masculinity because men were becoming more secular. But it also meant, well, if values are kicked out of the public sphere, where will they be cultivated? In the private sphere. And who will be responsible for cultivating them? Women. And so this is part of the double standard that developed
Mhm.
in the 19th century, where women were seen as the people who were supposed to, in a sense, be the means of reforming and refining and renewing their secularized husbands,
Mhm.
when they came home from work at night. Um, and it was also the reason that women led many of the reform movements. I mentioned that there was a huge increase in drinking, gambling, and so on, prostitution. And that's also why the 19th century was the era of this huge increase in reform movements,
Mhm.
all addressing these social problems. And many of them were driven by women because, of course, women didn't have paid jobs yet. And
Mhm.
women were seen as that was their proper role, the moral
Mhm.
guardians of society. And so what happened then is it increased the tension between men and women, right? Here's how one of my favorite historians, she is a feminist, but she puts it this way: all of the reform movements of the 19th century were implicit condemnations of males
Mhm.
because most of the social vices were traditionally male vices.
Mhm.
And here's how she puts it: there was little doubt as to the sex of the slave master, the tavern keeper, the drunkard, and the seducer. And so there was this tension between men and women that arose in the 19th
Mhm.
century when women were made the conscience of men.
Mhm.
And muscular Christianity was a reaction against that.
Okay.
It was like, wait a minute, men should not be let off the hook. Men should be just as moral and just as spiritual as women are. Spurgeon wrote this, by the way, the great Baptist preacher. He said, there's nothing that says that men should be any less moral, that they should be any less committed to the spiritual world as women are. Who said that women were superior to men? We need to counter that. Um, and it also led to the idea, of course, that um, since women were seen as morally and spiritually superior, that was kind of a feminization of Christianity as well.
Mhm.
And people
Mhm.
began to think that to become a member of a church was to leave your masculinity at the door.
Mhm.
And so muscular Christianity was a response to all of that. It was sort of the feminization of morality and
Mhm.
of religion. And they said, no, 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 we're going to reclaim religion and morality as manly traits,
Mhm.
as intrinsic to the masculine character. God created men to be moral and spiritual leaders. And this was, in many ways, this was an important course correction. I think it
Mhm.
was good. Unfortunately, it then, in some cases, went too far.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I have several quotes from people who part of the Muscular Christianity movement, who then started putting women down and started
Mm,
treating them as inferior and putting them on the lower rung, um, and treating them as uh, yeah, they basically reversed it. The
mm,
19th century put women on top, and muscular Christianity reversed it. And either one is not right. We need to be able to say, both men and women are creating God's image. Both of them have the dignity
mm,
and value that gives them, and then both of them are equally sinners. Men are
mhm,
not more prone to sin and vice than women are, but women are not spiritually inferior either. We need to really recover the ontological
mm.
equality. Ontological means in being. In being, men and women are equal in God's sight. So yeah, we're left. I think we're left. The muscular Christianity had some good parts, but it left some bad parts as well that
Mm,
I think we still see in the church today, where to some degree women are still seen as spiritually inferior.
mm.
And so, yeah, if we don't know our history, we don't know where these things come from, and
Right.
we can deal with them much more effectively if we see where they came from and how they developed.
Yes, which is why I am always drawn to your writing because I'm a big picture person and I always think, like if I see rotten fruit somewhere, like it doesn't help to just pick that fruit off the tree. Like you have to go to the root, like get to the root of the plant. But sometimes, I'm not a historian or a philosopher. So I'm like, I need help figuring out, what is the root of this? How did we get to where we are today? Before I ask you our next question, this is just a reminder to everyone within the next 10 minutes, we're going to transition over into a time of question and answer. So if you have a question about something that has been said or something that has not been said, don't forget to put that in the chat with a capital Q in front of it. One thing that I really found fascinating about this book, Professor Piercy, as you outlined this whole history of the view of masculinity from, the colonial era until the present, you went into some sociological research and you talked about how Christianity actually provides the answers for reversing, the course, both from putting men down and viewing everything as toxic to men just viewing these more aggressive traits as all that it means to be masculine. So can you go a little bit into the research and how what you found shows how Christianity really provides a way forward for us?
Yeah, I sort of stumbled on this literature, and realized I had the answer. You can't write a book on a problem until you get an answer, and I realized we have an answer. Um, so to give the background, most people, the secular narrative is that if anything, Christian men are the worst, that they're exhibit A of
Mm,
toxic masculinity. And I'll give you just one example. The co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement, said
mm.
this: the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Wow.
And so social scientists were listening to this and saying, well, you're making these accusations, but where's your evidence? You're
Mm,
making these charges, but where's your data? So they went out and did the studies, and I quote about a dozen studies in the book. And to my own surprise, Christian men actually test out as the best in terms of being engaged husbands and fathers.
mm,
Their wives test out as the happiest wives, and yes, they do interview them separately. I always get asked that. Um, Evangelical fathers spend more time with their children, 3.5
mm,
hours more per week than secular fathers. Evangelical couples divorce at a lower rate, 35% lower than
mm,
secular couples. And they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America.
mm.
Sometimes a quote can crystallize it. So let me give you one. The largest study was done by a sociologist named Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. And so this is from an article he wrote for the New York Times. Direct quote. He said, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, and it just got me there.
You're fine.
Um, direct quote. Um, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives.
Mm,
Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his fellow academicians. Sociology tends to be a highly secularized discipline. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular,
Hmm.
because evangelical Protestant married men with children are consistently the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So this is not a pep talk from a religious leader.
Hmm.
This is solid empirical research. These are evidence-based findings, and we should be confident bringing them both into the church and into the public realm.
Hmm.
And I have to tell you that it's not in the church yet. I had to go
Hmm.
digging in academic journals to find this.
Wow.
So I think it's something we need to bring into the church to encourage Christian men.
Yes, and I think what you're saying there is so important because as we've been talking through, the history of the view of masculinity and fathers' roles, and what it's like when fathers are absent consistently, I think it's really clear that boys and girls need this healthy view of masculinity through having it modeled through a dad who loves them and is following the Bible's commands, has a biblical view of masculinity. But if that doesn't come into the church, if men in the church don't understand this, what the data has revealed that actually it's men who are following the biblical worldview, who are the healthiest, most loving husbands and fathers, who are creating, the kids that are most likely to flourish in society, the men are not going to be encouraged to actually be confident in their masculinity, confident in who God has created them as distinctly male, confident, in their roles as, in the church and in the home. And so it's so important that we make sure that the men in our lives in the church understand this and can walk forward with this confidence. Um,
Yes. Oh,
Keep going.
you're probably going to ask for balance. I always like to make sure we have the balance,
Mm,
which is that nominal Christian men test out very differently.
mhm,
So, because otherwise people think you're kind of sweeping it under the carpet. The first pushback I always get is, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the world?
mm,
And
mhm,
so researchers did go back to the data and they did make that very important distinction between committed Christian men who attend church regularly, who are
mhm.
very authentic in their faith, versus nominal Christian men. My students don't even know what nominal means. So I have to tell them NON is Latin for name. It means in name only.
Mhm.
So these are men who, in a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but
Mm.
who attend church rarely, if at all. And they do test out dramatically different. They fit all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They
Mm.
spend less time with their children. They divorce actually at a higher rate than the
Wow.
secular world, 20% higher
Wow.
than the secular world. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in
Mm.
America. I'll give you another quote from Brad Wilcox, that same sociologist. This time he was writing in Christianity Today. And he said, the most violent husbands in America
Mm.
are evangelical Protestant nominal men
Mm.
who attend church rarely, if at all. Sorry, this cold is getting to
Wow.
me.
No, you're fine.
Um,
Which which that
nominal
makes
Christian
sense of
men.
the statistics that we're hearing because if both of these
Mhm.
groups of Christian men are lumped in together into
Yes,
one group, then of
yes.
course what we hear is going to be skewed.
Exactly. Most of the studies are done without making that distinction, and so
Mm.
they're getting men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men.
Mm.
And you know what I always say? It's also important for us to be teaching our young women what to watch out for. There's only one study I read that gave the numbers, and
Mm.
you and I probably hang out mostly with fairly committed Christians,
Mhm.
and so I thought nominals might be a small group. They're not. They're about the
Mm.
same size.
Wow.
So you have a roughly 50-50 chance when you meet a man who claims to be Christian, that he might be nominal. And
Mm.
I think young women need to know this so that they can be more discerning in the dating process.
Mhm.
Um, because I do have to, because I deal with the nominals, and they do have the highest rate of divorce of divorce and abuse and violence.
Mm.
I do have two chapters at the end of the book on abuse in Christian homes
Mhm.
because there are so many women who marry who they thought were Christian men, and they ended up being the nominals,
Right.
and so they end up being in abusive relationships, and so
Mm.
I had to deal with that in the book as well. And
Yes, which
what is the biblical way for the church to deal with abuse?
right, which I thought that was really, really helpful to have that section in there as well. Now, as we just wrap up this time and, we're thinking through, most of our listeners are parents or are working with children, and they're thinking through, how can I raise these kids to understand, what it means for someone to be a man, for our boys to grow up into men, and for our girls, who many of them will get married one day, what to look for in a man. So as you went through this research, you went through the whole history of, how masculinity has been viewed in the US. What recommendations would you give to parents as they're working with their children? Do you think there are certain things that we need to teach our children, or is it primarily just modeling for them, by them having dad in the home modeling this, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, I think presence is the first thing.
Mm,
Because if you, like we said, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, it was sheer presence. When
mm,
fathers had to be out of the home all day, and boys lost that role model. And today, of course, it's much worse because 40% of American children are growing up apart from their natural fathers,
mm,
and most of them see them rarely, if at all. It is the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. You
mm.
know, what a thing to be highest in, right?
Right.
Um, and so I think the most important long-term solution is reconnecting fathers to their sons. If we want to
Mm,
have a more healthy view of masculinity, it's the next generation being raised by their fathers or by good father substitutes. I'll give you first a quote. A psychiatrist put it this way: "We're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers."
mm,
Uh, that's it. And there was a study done on how fathers succeed in passing along. Well, it was on parents. How parents succeed in passing along their religious convictions, their moral
mm,
and spiritual convictions to the children. It was a 35-year
mm.
longitudinal study, won all kinds of awards, and they found two surprising things. The first one was fathers matter more than mothers.
Wow.
And my female students say, "Well, that's not fair." I say, "Well, it's a fact." Mothers have an influence, but statistically, if the father's a Christian, he has a higher influence on
Mm,
whether the children follow him in the faith. The second thing they found, though, is the quality of the relationship is what counts. He
mm,
can be a moral exemplar. He can have perfect theology. He can be a pillar of the church. But if he's perceived as cold, distant, authoritarian, his kids won't follow him. They
mm,
will not follow him. And
mm,
so the quality of the relationship, it needs to be warm, close, and loving. And what was fascinating is that there was a secular study that reinforced this. It was looking specifically at how to raise masculine sons,
mm,
which is part of what we're looking for, right? And and they found the same thing. This study
mm,
said that the father's own masculinity doesn't matter. Whether he's more macho, or more gentle, doesn't matter. What matters is the quality of the relationship.
mm,
If it's a
mm,
warm, loving, close relationship, then the son will have a stable, strong, secure sense of masculinity.
mm,
So I think it's the father son relationship we really want to focus on. And,
mm,
you know, the the main barrier, of course, is still that we live in an industrial world where men have to be out of the home all day.
mhm,
But people are starting to, you know, tinker with the workplace. The
mm,
pandemic was a game changer
mhm,
because a lot of fathers discovered they liked being closer to their kids. In fact, Harvard University did a study. It's not in the book because it's so recent, but Harvard University did a study, and their finding was during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children,
mm.
and they don't want to lose that.
Wow.
They would prefer to keep some sort of a hybrid situation, with some
Mm,
remote work, some flexible hours, and so on. But of course, you've got to get the CEOs on board as well.
right.
And so I quote some of them in the book as well. CEOs saying things like, "Well, we were a little worried about remote work, but here's how one CEO put it: the pandemic has completely exploded those fears. We did
Mm,
not see any discernible drop in productivity."
mm.
So this is what this is helping us. I say take these quotes to your boss, and show them that actually having a better balance, work family balance, is better for men. I mean, we usually talk
Mhm.
about work family balance for women, but in a very large study, 70% of men said that they would prefer flexible hours that gave them more time with their children, even
Mhm.
if it meant a lower salary.
Mhm.
70% of men were willing to take that. And it was funny because a completely separate study done by completely separate people found that women agreed.
Wow.
70%, same number, 70% of wives said they would rather have more time with their husband, even if it
Mhm.
meant he was bringing home a lower paycheck.
Mhm.
So everyone's saying we want more family time,
Mhm.
and that is the most important long-term solution for raising
Mhm.
healthier sons with a strong biblical sense of masculinity.
Mhm. Wow. Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up this portion of the discussion. So, for those of you watching and listening, I know not everyone might be in a position where you can do remote work or potentially do that, but that's something, if you're in a position where you or your husband are working, long hours outside of the home, to even just begin praying about, God, is there a possibility for some hybrid here that I really want to be more present with my children at home? I know that I've even seen that. I'm single, I'm not married, I don't have children, but in my friends' lives, I have a number of friends whose husbands are either, they're pastors. And so they're at small church plants. And so their office is in the home,
Mm,
and so they're just more present. Or I have another friend who her husband, he does more like digital marketing and stuff, but he works 4 days a week from home, and he still has to have his times, where he's focused and he's working, but he's present at lunch, with the kids, or, if there's an emergency, he's there. And so just something to be thinking and praying through, because as Professor Piercy said, really having that model and having that close relationship between father and son is so important. Okay, we're going to transition into our time of questions. So if you have a question, make sure you put it in the chat with a capital Q, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Okay, so first question: how do we encourage our sons to be men who will lead their families in a masculine way when our culture has fallen so far away from a good normal? So, what are your thoughts, Professor Piercy?
that was pretty broad.
Yes.
Well, let me, maybe this would be a way to answer that. Um, I think that one of the dangers is that our boys are picking up secular ideas. If the church is not
Mm,
teaching a healthy biblical view of masculinity, one of my former graduate students now teaches high school. And she emailed me not long ago and she said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate.
mm.
They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school.
Wow.
And so I thought, yeah, that's what I said. Wow. Um, how they're reaching out to these online influencers.
Mm,
And Andrew Tate is not a good influence. He tracks them because he's buff
mhm,
and he says work out, get healthy,
mhm,
and those are the good messages. But then they
mhm.
get drawn into the negative messages because I mean he openly calls himself a pimp and he
Right.
openly says that what he does is produce pornography. And by the way, there's another up and coming influencer. He's been heralded in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate,
Mm,
and his name is Myron Gaines. And his program is called Fresh and Fit, and it's becoming quite popular.
mm.
And his tagline is, I help men transform from simps into pimps.
Oh gosh.
And it was a Christian man who told me about this, by the way, and told me, oh, it's a really good program. And I watched it. A Christian man thinks this is a good program. Anyway, the point is, if there's a vacuum in the church, our
Mhm,
young men are going to be reaching out. And I think, we went through a period where the response on the part of young men was to go passive, right? Sit in your mom's basement and play
mhm,
video games. I think we're seeing a shift now to the opposite.
mhm,
Jordan Peterson, who I think is a good influence, um,
mhm.
and others are saying to young men, no, get out there and make something of yourself. But unfortunately, then they reach out to the Andrew Tates of the world. Um, let me maybe this is relevant as well. Part of the attack on masculinity has been that, and we didn't cover this in the interview, but boys and men are actually falling behind And I do
Mm,
think it's partly because of the attack on masculinity. Boys are falling
mhm.
behind at all levels of education, and this is what Christian parents need to be really aware of as well. It starts in kindergarten. They don't have the same fine motor control that girls do, so they can't use the scissors as well.
Right.
So already in kindergarten, they feel like they're falling behind, and all through high school, they have lower test scores, lower grades. More more women than men are going to college now. Do you realize it's 60% female,
Wow.
40% male? Small Christian colleges are even worse. When I started at Houston Christian, it was 70-30.
Wow.
And do you know how
Wow.
we decided to attract more boys? We started a football team, which did help, and we started an engineering school to teach more
Hmm.
STEM
Hmm.
subjects. And we are
Right.
now almost at the 60-40. We're
Okay.
almost average now.
Wow.
Um, More women than men are going to graduate school, and then once they get out of school, men are falling behind in terms of higher levels of drug addiction, drug and alcohol addiction,
Mhm.
mental illness, homelessness,
Mhm.
suicide, um, prison,
Right.
crime. Some 90% of prison inmates are male, and male unemployment. Researchers tell us now it's not showing up in the unemployment statistics because they stopped looking for work. So they had
Mhm.
to dig deeper, and they're telling us that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. That was
Mm.
shocking.
Wow.
We remember what a crisis that was.
Right.
And life expectancy. Male life expectancy has gone down, women's has not. So it's not a
Mhm.
general trend.
Mm.
But there was a magazine called The New Scientist that went through this data and said the greatest demographic factor now for early death is being male. So this is what we need to realize. Our boys are up against a culture where boys
Mm.
and men are falling behind at all levels,
Mhm.
and they need a lot of extra support. And by the way, girls got ahead not on their own. It was because there was a lot of social support. 1972, Title IX, 1994 Gender Equity Act poured millions and millions of dollars
Mhm.
into curriculum supportive of girls, training workshops, equity training, and training materials. And people thought, okay, we're going to bring girls up to where boys are. Nobody anticipated that girls would shoot right past the boys. And that's what's
Right.
happened. But they had a lot of support to do it. And so I
Right.
would say we need to ask other ways that we can give boys the extra support that we gave girls. It's a harder sell. There's a lot of groups out there, especially feminist groups, that stand in the way. They say, no, no, no. They treat it like a zero sum game and say, no, they've shut down programs for girls.
Mhm.
The first book on the subject was called The War Against Boys, and it was by Christina Huff Summers, who herself is a feminist.
Hmm.
And she said every time I proposed a program to help boys, feminist groups would shoot it down. And
Mhm.
so that's what we're up against. Our boys are having a harder time in school, and we need to be aware of that as parents. And we need to
Right.
ask what are some ways that we can give our boys extra support to stand against a culture that is denigrating masculinity.
Right. And I think that's a really important thing to bring up. So, just in connection with what you said there. So, for anyone watching, this is not me blanket saying that you have to do this, but as a teacher, I am a huge proponent of waiting until boys are 6 to enter them into kindergarten because I just watched throughout my decade in the classroom, I watched the boys in my classroom who the parents had just given them an extra year to catch up with some of those fine motor skills that the girls had. And I just watched them really flourish. Now that doesn't ring true if your child has a learning disability. An extra year isn't necessarily going to help them. But in general, I'm a big proponent of waiting until 6 to register boys in kindergarten if you're going to go through a traditional schooling model. And then also just to add to what you said, Professor Piercy, as we think about, preparing sons to become men, who lead in a masculine way, we've talked a lot about the importance of modeling. And so I don't know who this questioner is, and if like if your husband is a good model of what it means to be male, but if he's not, this is where I think the body of Christ really comes in, that it's so important to make sure that we're getting rooted in a church that is biblical and that has people, has Christians coming who are living according to the biblical worldview. Because I just think of my church, which is not a perfect place because we're all sinners, but I just think of my church and how many men there are in my church who do such a good job of modeling what it means to be distinctly male according to God's very good design. And I think, even if a single mom came to our church, I don't think we have any single moms right now, but even if we did, or if we had a mom that came without her husband, if she was just, implemented into our body of Christ, her children would naturally be around men who are modeling this. And so would really encourage you that, if your husband is modeling this, if he is walking with Jesus, he's living faithfully according to the biblical worldview, point out to your children things that he's doing well, praise him in front of them so that they see these things that he is doing really well. And then if he's not, don't put him down. But as you're around other men in your church who are doing these things so well, lift them up and, point out to your son, isn't it so amazing, the way Mr. So and so really cares for his children, how he's always at their games, like encouraging them. So just pointing out men who are doing this really well and lifting them up so that your son has these role models in his life. Let's see. Oh,
Let me step in on the question of waiting a year. There is a new book out. It's again, it's so new that it's not even in my book. A new book out called Of Men and Boys, and it's by
mhm,
Richard Reeves. He's been at the Brookings Institution, and so he's the first liberal writing on this topic. For some reason, the topic of boys falling behind has been coded conservative. Uh,
mm,
and um, this is the first bona fide liberal who's taken it up, and he was, he had to be very courageous. He was told, "Don't touch this topic." But I pointed out because he has made a big point of what you just said. He said, "Hold boys back." He calls it red shirting. I don't know where that phrase comes from,
mhm,
but he says, "Hold boys back a year." They are developmentally slower than girls, and that's one of his top recommendations is
mm,
holding boys back. The second recommendation is find a single sex school if you can,
mm,
because again, when boys are significantly lower in their later in their development, it's awfully hard. By puberty,
mhm,
girls are shooting ahead and boys are
mhm,
falling behind. Just in physical development. So keeping them behind a year and finding a same-sex school if you can, single-sex school if you can. Those are his two top recommendations. But if you want a good book on the subject, it's very secular. He's not a Christian, but he's the first liberal to say, "Okay,
mhm,
guys, it's not just conservatives who care about boys falling behind. We liberals have to start looking into this as well because it is
mhm.
becoming that big of an issue. It's such an issue that he left the Brookings Institution and started his own
Wow.
organization called, I think, something like Association for Boys and Men.
Hmm,
And if you want to keep up on the research, you can sign up for his, to get his publications. He's going to be researching things that help boys. So,
hmm,
of boys and men, you can sign up and get regular updates on their research as well if you
mhm.
have boys and want to stay up on what's the latest.
Yes, thank you. Great recommendation. We'll make sure that we pass that along when we have our show notes for this. Okay, I don't know if you'll be familiar with this, Professor Piercy. I'm not super familiar with this. Do you have any thoughts on John Eldridge's Wild at Heart book and other podcasts slash info in relation to authentic manhood?
Yeah, I was very careful not to name John Eldridge by name in my book because I don't want to get into other people's battles.
Right.
you know, there's a lot of people I didn't name in the book just because
Mhm,
I don't want to be a part of other people's
mhm,
battles. I want my own message.
mhm,
Um, but it is true that the theme of men being wild and getting away into the outdoors and recovering their true masculinity was a late 19th century trend. It was
mhm,
part of the reaction against the Victorian age where women was seen as morally superior. And women led a lot of those reform movements. And like I
mhm.
said, let me give you a single fact. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
Wow.
So there was a reason there was a temperance movement.
Right.
But there were all of these, it was just one, the abolition movement. There were movements against prostitution and sex trafficking. There were all kinds of social movements. There were so many that historians refer to them collectively as the benevolent empire.
Mm.
and and men and women were largely leading them. And so men began to feel like they began finally to kind of rebel against that. They said, I'm tired of being painted as a villain.
Mm.
And so that's when we got, it was late 19th century, you got all this male fiction where men were portrayed as recovering their authentic masculinity by getting away from women, away from family, away from civilization, and out into the wilderness as mountain men and scouts and living on the frontier and living with the cowboys and roping cattle. The Western, this is when the Western was born as a genre, and they all had sort of the undertone of, we got to get away from this sort of feminized culture
Mm.
that the Victorian culture has become so feminized, and all of these reform movements they're very moralistic. They're telling men,
Mm.
stop drinking, stop gambling, stop fighting, stop going to the brothels. You know, they came across as quite moralistic, especially as men were becoming more secular. So
Mm.
there was not that inner, you know, personal conviction of biblical morality.
Mm.
Then it becomes imposed from outside. And of course, there's a whole book called The Male Revolt, and it's how men began to revolt against all of these reform movements. And so, unfortunately, I think what some Christians do is they look at that literature and they say, "Oh, you know, all of these." I'll give you some examples. The Last of the Mohicans, or Herman Melville, right? All of his books are set at sea. And you know what he said? I set them at sea because I thought of that the sea was the place, direct quote, of the utmost male license, where men can just break free from civilization. And of course, Ernest Hemingway, I don't know
Mm.
if you've read his books, but they're all about men getting out as soldiers, as outdoorsmen, as
Mm.
explorers, as whatever, finding their true masculinity, getting away from women and family and civilization.
Mm.
There's a really wonderful, a famous literary critic who says, our American male fiction is all about getting away from, from marriage and from civilization. And, in a sense, authentic manhood is recovering your boyhood.
Mhm.
And he said all of our American fiction is very boyish. At any rate, I think some Christian authors have picked up on that and have sort of put a Christian overlay over this 19th century theme. And so in my
Mhm.
book, I counter that many times by saying actually it's more biblical to go back to the cultural mandate.
Mhm.
The cultural mandate, for anyone who, about half my students don't have a theological background where they know that term. So it's a theologians refer to Genesis 1, where God has created the first human couple. And what's the first thing he says to them? He tells them why he created them, what their
Mhm.
purpose is. Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And
Mhm.
be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean the nuclear family, right? Because anthropologists will tell us that all the social institutions grow out of the family, becomes a clan, a tribe, a nation,
Mm.
or specific social institutions like the state, the church, the school, the marketplace. And
Mm.
so it really means build up all of the social institutions that constitute a society. Harness, subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So that's God saying, get your hands dirty first with, again, it starts usually with agriculture, but then mining and technology and inventing computers and composing music. One of my students said, "Oh, come on, composing music," and I play the violin. So I said, "What's the violin made out of? Wood, and the bow, horsehair." So all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with
Mm.
harnessing the natural resources of God's
Mhm.
creation. And so I bring men back to this in my book. I mean, it's for men and women, but I think it's especially important for men because
Mhm.
we have such a sacred secular split that many men think becoming a Christian, we're calling them to sit in a pew and pray. And that's good. But we're also calling them to the cultural mandate.
Mhm.
That obedience to the cultural mandate means roll up your sleeves and get deeply embedded in your family, in the social institutions of your culture, and in productive and creative work that serves your society. They call it the cultural mandate because it means God's original purpose for us was to
Mm-hmm.
build cultures, to build civilizations. And so that's before the fall. So that's God's pre-fall instructions. And I think that gives us a much richer view. And for
Mm-hmm.
men in particular, it gives them a sense of, that there's a place for them to gain a sense of achievement, accomplishment, and impact in their Christian life.
Yes. I love the way you took that simple question and you brought it back to history and then to scripture. And so I know we don't have time to get through all of the questions that were submitted, but I would just highly encourage everyone to check out this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, because as you've seen today with Professor Pearcey sharing what she researched for that book and then also answering the questions that have been asked are very thoroughly answered, I think, in this book. And then so go back, learn what history teaches us about the view of masculinity through the ages. Go back to scripture, look at what do we see demonstrated in Jesus. And anytime we're looking at a piece, like whether it's secular or it's Christian, we can ask ourselves, is this author just bringing in their own ideas? And especially if it's biblical, if it's supposedly a Christian author, is this author just pulling out different pieces of scripture and kind of attaching them to some cultural idea? Or are they actually deeply rooted? And do we see this in the character of Jesus? Well, Professor Piercy, thank you so much for joining me today. It's just been such a joy to have you here with us.
It was excellent talking with you. Yeah, I'm just going to repeat that you have such a teacher's heart. It comes out in everything you say, and I do. I really appreciate what you're doing here with your ministry.
Oh, thank you. And for everyone watching and listening, just looking for more information too on how to raise boys and girls with a healthy biblical view of gender and sexuality here at Foundation Worldview, Lord willing, next month, we are launching our God's Good Design curriculum for kids 4 on up, which is going to ground them in the biblical view of identity, gender, marriage, and family. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Hi, friends. I wanted to do just a quick follow up after the amazing webinar that you just heard. As you know, Professor Piercy shared almost an hour long, amazing analysis and evaluation of just how we have gotten to the place we are culturally, just throughout history. Many of the things that have arisen in the view of masculinity that is not distinctly biblical, and how the Bible offers corrections to that. And one thing I wanted to do after you have received all of that amazing information is just to talk through a few practical strategies for how to implement what you heard covered in this webinar. And I think there are 4 specific things that we can do. The first thing that I think all of us need to do is ask ourselves how we view masculinity. That it's always important for us to discern, where has our view of a certain topic just been developed culturally or historically versus where is it grounded biblically? So to really sit down and ask ourselves, what traits do we view as distinctly masculine? How do we view men? Do we think masculinity is a good thing? What do we view as masculinity? And then once we've sat down and thought through that, then we need to identify those areas that have just been constructed culturally, whether it's been in the culture at large or even within subculture in the church, and correct any areas where we have brought the secular script for manhood into our worldview instead of having a distinctly biblical one. So that's the first thing that we need to do. We need to ask ourselves how we view masculinity and then evaluate, where has our view of masculinity gone awry by buying into a secular script, and where is it distinctly biblical? And then we need to course correct. Highly recommend, as I have mentioned before, that you actually pick up a copy of this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, because everything that was covered in the webinar is covered so much more in depth in this book. And as you seek to parse out where is your view of manhood and masculinity biblical and where is it just strictly secular, this book is going to help a lot. The second thing that I think we need to do is we need to ensure that our children are around biblical role models of masculinity. Now, we touched on this briefly in the webinar, but it's so important that if we want to raise boys and girls who have a healthy understanding of what it means to be masculine, this needs to be modeled for our children. That yes, we can sit down and we can explain to them, what it means to be male or what it means to be female. But for them to really understand this, they need to see it in action. So for those of you moms who are watching, if you have a husband who is a Christian and who exemplifies Christ in the way that he portrays his masculinity, it's so important that you praise him in front of your children. When he cares for your family, when he guides them, when he instructs them, when he nurtures them, when he plays with your kids, it's so important that you publicly praise him in front of your children. Now, if you're a dad watching and listening, it's so important for you to make sure that you are actually there, that you're present with your children so that they have this biblical view of what masculinity is. Now, for any moms who are watching where your husband is not a believer or he's not present, whether that's through divorce or through death or through some other kind of tragedy, this is where the men at your church can take over this role of providing a godly example of what it means to be masculine. So I would encourage you to actually ask one or two men who are in your local church if they could intentionally invest in your children. Now, this doesn't mean that they have to be present with them every day, but if they can just make sure to go out of their way to interact with them during a corporate worship service. If you could have their families over for dinner maybe once a month. And now, even if you are in a situation where you are in a healthy biblical marriage and your husband does a great job of portraying what it means to be masculine, or if you are the husband and you do a great job of what it is or portraying what it is to be masculine, it's so important for us to root ourselves and our kids in the local church, because while dads are this primary example and are so necessary in this process, our kids need to see more examples of healthy masculinity. And so that's going to be found within the local church. So as we frequently encourage you on the Foundation Worldview podcast and webinars to actually start practicing biblical hospitality, to open up your home to others within your church, your local church, to start forging those relationships. The third thing that I think is really practical that we can do based on what was covered in this webinar is to reevaluate our schedules. Professor Pearcey talked about how important it is, especially for boys, to have healthy relationships with their dads. And relationships require time. There's this lie floating around in our culture that quality time is more important than quantity of time. And that's just simply not true. Do we need quality time? Yes. However, a parent who spends 1 hour of quality time with their children a week is not going to have near the depth of relationship than a parent who is with their children for 8 to 12 to 24 hours a day. So while quality time is important, it's just a flat out lie to think that quality time can replace quantity of time. So it's really important that we reevaluate our schedules and look at where are we just on this giant hamster wheel to nowhere, where we're running so fast that we don't have time to actually sit down and build relationships. Family meal times are so important. Even if you can't do family meal times 5 to 7 nights a week, striving for 3 to 4 nights a week can make a huge difference. Those times actually sitting down, having a meal together, having times where dads can be playing with their kids and moms can be playing with their kids, times of actually having family worship and Bible study. So important. And then would really encourage families to actually think through, is partial or full working from home a possibility? Now, I understand that for many careers, if you are a medical doctor, working from home is really not a possibility because you need to be with your patients. You actually need to be physically present with them. But are there ways that you can be creative with your schedule so that you are present more often with your children, where there are a number of positions, especially because so much of what we do is done online, where people are still required to go into the office, but what they are doing could actually be done from home. So think through, is it actually a possibility that you could work at least part-time from home? This is something to really pray about and think through. Okay, God, could you open up a way for me or for my husband to be able to spend more times with the kids? Even get creative about how you're thinking through this. And then if you do have the opportunity to work, when dads do have the opportunity to work from home, either part-time or full-time, brainstorm ways to actually have children involved in the work. One thing that we didn't talk about in the webinar, but that Professor Pearcey covers in this book, is how in the more agrarian society before the Industrial Revolution, Parents and children were working alongside one another. The dads and moms were teaching their kids different skills. And so whatever the dad did as a profession, whether he was a farmer or a blacksmith or a cobbler or a newspaper printer, whatever he did, the children were there and understood what he did. Where now, often dad goes to an office, kids have no idea what he does. So just brainstorm, are there ways that you could have your children involved in your work? Now, obviously, you can't have your kids involved all the time with most jobs, but even just thinking, if you are a graphic designer and you're designing a website for someone, and you're choosing different color schemes, could you give your kids paint swatches and say, you know what, I'm going to be designing this website this week. And here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to find several colors that you think would be really good in this website. Now, you don't just blindly go with their color choices. You have to make a professional decision, but you can have them involved in that way. And then you can talk through, oh, here's why I think that color you chose would be a really good idea. You know what? I like that color you chose, but here's why I think we're going to go with another color. This just gets them involved in the work process in some way so that they understand a little bit of what you do and they feel involved in it in some way. The fourth thing that I think that we can do based on what we've covered in this webinar is really to encourage our sons whenever we see them treat others as Christ would, because Jesus is the ultimate example of masculinity. And so what we see Jesus doing in the Gospels, that should be our standard for what it means for someone to truly be a man. And so whenever we see our children, whenever we specifically our sons, whenever we see them, and the reason I'm saying specifically our sons is not because this is more important to encourage sons, but because just the contents of this webinar is talking about masculinity. So when we think about this, to encourage our sons, whenever we see them, respond with humility. Whenever we see them help out someone who's weaker than them, whenever we see them look out for the needs of others, whenever we see them make a really wise decision, that we encourage them in their masculinity. Like, wow, I can see by the way that you treated that person, you are going to be an amazing man one day. That as God grows you into a man, you're going to become a man after his own heart. And I can see that because of the way you treated this person or because of the way that you did this. So again, these are my 4 recommendations. First, that we ask ourselves how we view masculinity and then parse out where our view is biblical and where it's not so that we can develop a fully biblical view of masculinity. Then ensure that our children are around biblical role models for masculinity, and specifically their dads, but if that's not possible, the other men in the local church. And even if dad is present and is a wonderful example of biblical masculinity, to continue to have others in the local church invest there. Then to reevaluate our schedules to see where we can invest more time building strong relationships with our children, and then encourage our sons when we see them treat others as Christ would. Thank you again so much for joining us for this webinar today. It's my prayer that this content has been beneficial and that it will really guide and encourage you as you continue to raise your sons and daughters with a healthy view of masculinity. I'll see you next time.